You're standing behind the counter at 2:47 a.m. And the only thing between you and the black glass outside is a thin pane and a fluorescent hum that never quite sounds right. You've worked the graveyard shift long enough to know the unwritten law every blue-collar night clerk whispers, but never writes down, never break the rule. Some say don't look at the security mirror after 3 a.m. Others say if a child comes in alone with no car in the lot, you lock the door and hide in the back. These aren't campfire tales. They're survival manuals passed from one exhausted worker to the next in break rooms that smell of stale coffee and fear. I've collected 5 true graveyard shift convenience store horror stories from the UK, the US, Canada, and Australia, where ordinary people in hives, vests, and name tags came face to face with something that wouldn't scan at the register. Their blue-collar nightmares aren't about monsters under the bed. They're about things that stand in the doorway at the loneliest hour and wait for you to make the one mistake that changes everything. If you hear a second set of footsteps on a floor you're sure is empty, or if the customer smiling at you hasn't blinked once, you'll wish you'd listened. Because once you break the rule, you belong to the night. Before we enter these true horrors, tap like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what's the unspoken rule you'd never break on a night shift. Liam had been pulling night shifts at the Moto service station on the M62 for nearly 3 years and thought he'd seen it all. Lorry drivers with bloodshot eyes buying 12 cans of Red Bull, teenagers giggling through hangovers at 4 in the morning, and the occasional lost tourist who couldn't work out British coins but nothing had, prepared him for the man in the olive wax jacket who first walked in on the 13th of November at exactly 3:03 a.m. The CCTV would later show him approaching from the motorway footbridge, even though no vehicle was parked in the lorry area. And the fog that night was so dense the automatic doors seemed to open onto a wall of solid gray wool. And Liam was restocking the sandwich chiller when the entry chime pinged, and he straightened up to offer the standard all right, only to find the man already standing 3 feet from the counter with both hands flat on the worn laminate surface, fingers so pale they looked bleached. And Liam's first thought was that this bloke had some sort of medical condition, because he hadn't blinked not once, and his eyes were the color of dishwater, but held a stillness that made Liam's stomach clench the way it did when a fight was about to break out. And the man said in a voice that sounded like it was coming from much farther away than his lips' pack of Rothman's Blue and a scratch card, "Any kind will do." And Liam, who had dealt with 8R customers at this hour, turned to the cigarette gantry, and when he looked back, the man's head had tilted maybe 10 degrees, but his eyes were still pinned open and unblinking. And Liam didn't want to be rude. You don't survive night shifts by antagonizing strangers, so he just slid the pack across the counter and said, "Scratch cards are there by the till, mate. Pick whichever calls to you." And the man's hand closed around the cigarettes with a sound like dry leaves being crushed. And he didn't even glance at the scratch card display, just took one from the front and paid with a crumpled tenner that felt wet, though there was no rain outside. And then he left the same way he'd come, the fog swallowing him in 2 steps. And Liam let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, and that was when he noticed the scratch card the man had taken was still on the counter, completely untouched, and the 10-pound note in the till had turned into a faded receipt from a petrol station that had closed 6 years ago. And Liam told himself it was a prank some local lads having a laugh with an old receipt. But at 3:03 a.m. the next night, the chime pinged again, and the same man in the olive jacket was already at the counter. Same hands flat, same unblinking eyes, and this time he said pack of Rothman's Blue, but no scratch card tonight, and Liam heart hammering against his ribs, pulled the cigarettes with shaking fingers, and asked as casually as he could manage, "Long drive tonight?" And the man's lips stretched into something that wasn't a smile, more like the corners of his mouth were being pulled by invisible threads. And he replied, "I never left." And when Liam looked down at the counter where the cigarettes should have been, there was only a small pool of water, cold as ditch water. And the man was already back out in the fog, leaving no footprints on the wet concrete. And Liam told his supervisor the next day, who just laughed and said, "That's old Harry. He used to work the pumps here before the M62 was widened. Died on that footbridge in the fog in '83, trying to push a stranded motorist to safety. Just give him the Rothmans, and don't say anything else, or he'll stand there all night." And Liam might have believed it was a ghost story the old-timers told to spook new hires, except that on the third night, the fog came down again. The chime didn't just pin, it held. A single, continuous electronic whine, and the automatic doors slid open and stayed open. And the man in the olive jacket was standing in the doorway, and this time his mouth was moving, but the words came from the store's own intercom, crackling through the ceiling speakers in a voice that was no longer far away. "Where's my scratch card, Liam?" "I always take a scratch card." And Liam, legs locked and bladder threatening to let go, grabbed the closest scratch card from the display, a Christmas one. In November, and held it out, and the man walked forward, and his feet made no sound, but the chill that came with him was so profound the drink's chiller behind. Liam fogged over, and when his fingers brushed Liam's hand, they weren't cold, they were absent. The sensation of touching something that had forgotten how to be solid. And then the man took the scratch card, turned without blinking, and walked back into the fog. And the doors closed with a soft pneumatic hiss. And Liam immediately rang his supervisor and said he was quitting. And the supervisor sighed and said, "Just don't turn up on the 13th again. That's his night, and whatever you do, don't mention the scratch card, because Harry always wants to win something. If he ever does win, he won't need the fog anymore." And Liam never worked another night shift in his life. Every November, he still checks his mail for a Christmas scratch card he never bought, because he's terrified that one day, one will arrive with a single number scratched off the winning number and a message in damp letters that simply says, "Thanks, mate." Petro Plus, off I-40 in Holbrook, Arizona, was the kind of place that existed in the seams between desert and highway. Darnell had been working the graveyard counter there for 8 months when he learned the unspoken rule that the third pump from the left, the one with the flickering fluorescent canopy light, was never supposed to be used between 2 o'clock and 3:30 a.m. Not because the pump was broken or the credit card reader was slow, but because that was the hour when the smiling trucker came through. And Darnell's predecessor, a grizzled veteran named Gus, who had walked off mid-shift and never come back, had left a single post-it note taped under the register that read in shaky capitals, "If he smiles wider than a normal man can, do not look at the big rig, just keep scanning." And Darnell found that note on his third night alone after the graveyard manager quit and the company was so desperate for coverage they'd promoted a stock boy with 0 training. And at first he thought it was a joke, because who leaves a cryptic warning about a smiling trucker? But on the night of June 18th, when the thermometer outside still read 93 degrees at 2:15 a.m., and the heat shimmered off the asphalt like a living thing, Darnell saw an 18-wheeler glide into Pump 3 with an engine so silent it might have been rolled in by the desert wind. And the rig was clean, a glossy midnight blue with no logo, no license plate Darnell could see, and no dust, despite the fact that every vehicle on I-40 picked up a fine red coat of Arizona grit within 10 miles. And the driver's door opened and a man dropped down onto the concrete with the lightness of someone who didn't weigh what he should. And Darnell watched through the grimy window as the man walked toward the store, and the smile was already there. A broad, friendly grin that hit the corners of his eyes. The kind of smile that should have been reassuring, but Darnell's lizard brain was screaming because the smile wasn't moving. It was fixed, the lips curled up, but the muscles of the face utterly still. And the man pushed through the door and the bell jingled, and he said in a voice like honey poured over gravel hot one tonight, and Darnell said, "You said it." And the man placed a single item on the counter, a bag of pork rinds. The spicy kind, and, as Darnell scanned it, he saw the man's rig through the window and every single light. On the trailer was off except one small amber marker that blinked exactly once, and when he looked back, the man's smile had widened, literally widened. The corners of his mouth now reaching up toward his ears in a way that human anatomy simply doesn't allow. And Darnell's hand froze over the register, and the man said, "You're new, aren't you? Gus never told you about me, did he?" And Darnell, throat so tight he could barely speak, managed, "Who are you?" And the man's smile stretched another impossible degree, and he said, "I'm the reason they built that bypass around the old Route 66. The one that dead ends at the canyon where the bus went over in '77. You ever wonder why they never found all the passengers?" And Darnell, who had grown up hearing stories about the tour bus that vanished into Diablo Canyon with 53 souls on board and only 47 bodies ever recovered, felt the temperature in the store drop 30 degrees. And the man picked up his pork rinds and said, "See you next week, Darnell," using a name Darnell had never told him. A name that wasn't on his NAMA tag, because the NAMA tag still said Gus. And then the man walked back to his silent rig, climbed in, and the entire 18-wheeler dissolved into the heat shimmer like sugar in hot water, leaving nothing but the red dust of the parking lot and a single amber light that blinked twice and went dark. And Darnell stumbled to the back office and threw up in the trash can, and then did what Gus had probably done. He grabbed his keys and drove home at 90 miles an hour with the radio blasting gospel music. And the next morning he went back to collect his last paycheck, and the day manager said Gus quit the same way. So the smiling trucker told him his real name, and then one night Gus just never came in. And between you and me, 6 missing persons reports from truck stops along I-40 in the last 20 years all have the same detail in the witness statements: a blue rig with no plates and a driver who never stopped smiling. At every single disappearance happened on a Thursday between 2 o'clock and 3:30 a.m. So I'm going to give you some advice, Darnell. Don't come in on Thursday. And if you ever see a bag of pork rinds on the shelf that looks older than the building itself, just leave it there, because that's how he marks where he's been. And Darnell now works the day shift at a grocery store, 3 towns over, where he never has to look at a truck stop after dark. But sometimes when he's driving home late and he sees an 18-wheeler with its amber markers blinking in the rearview mirror, he pulls over and lets it pass, and he never, ever looks at the driver's face, because deep down, he's terrified that one day the smile will be there, wider than a normal man can make it, and the driver will wave. And Darnell will know that Gus wasn't missing, he was taken, one Thursday at a time. Callum had been working the overnight servo on the Stewart Highway, just north of Cooper Petty, for 5 months. And the isolation was something you either grew into or it ate you alive. And Callum thought he'd made peace with the empty red desert that pressed against the windows like a held breath. But the one thing he could never get used to was the large convex security mirror mounted in the far corner above the cold drinks. The kind meant to eliminate blind spots so you could see anyone skulking in the aisles. And on his very first night, the departing manager, a wiry woman named Shaz who smelled of diesel and resignation, had pointed at that mirror and said never look at it directly between 3:33 and 3:36 a.m. That's when the reflection isn't yours. And if you see someone standing behind you in the glass who isn't in the store, you do not turn around. You just walk to the back room and wait until the clock ticks over to 3:37, no matter what you hear. And Callum had laughed because, of course. He had Australian humor runs on taking the mickey out of the new bloke, but Shaz didn't. Smile, and she added the last bloke who turned around is still standing in aisle 3, or at least his reflection is. And then she grabbed her bag and drove off into the sunrise without looking back, and for 5 months, Callum followed the rule religiously. Each night between 3:33 and 3:36, he kept his eyes locked on the register screen or the security monitor that showed the outside cameras, never once glancing at that convex mirror, and things were fine, boring even. Until a Tuesday in February, when a massive road train pulled in at 3:31, and the driver, a sun-cracked man with a beard like steel wool, wanted 6 meat pies heated up and a chat about the cricket. Callum, distracted by the microwave and the driver's rambling, lost track of time, and at 3:34 he turned to hand the driver his change, and his gaze swept past the mirror and froze, because in the convex glass he saw himself standing at the counter exactly as he was. But behind him, barely a meter away, was a figure that wasn't in the store, a tall shape with no discernible features, just a darkness that absorbed the fluorescent light. And it was leaning forward as if it were whispering into Callum's reflected ear, and Callum did what Shaz had told him not to do. He turned around, and the store was empty, except for the road train driver who was now staring at him with sudden sharp attention, and the driver said, "You right, mate. It looked like you've seen a ghost." And Callum croaked, "I'm fine, just tired." And he handed over the pies, and the driver left. And Callum stood frozen, heart punching his ribs, and then he made the second mistake. He looked back at the mirror, and now the reflection showed something much worse. He wasn't in it at all. The counter was there. The pie warmer was there. But where Callum should have been standing was just empty air, and the dark figure was now in front of the counter. It's facing the mirror, and it had no face, but Callum knew with an absolute certainty that it was looking at him through the glass. And then his own reflection appeared again, but it was wrong. It was wearing his uniform and had his face, but its expression was one he'd never made in his life. A slack emptiness, with a tiny smile that twitched at the left corner. And the figure behind it placed what might have been a hand on his reflection's shoulder. And the reflection's smile widened, and Callum heard a voice that seemed to come from the air itself, not a sound but a sensation against his eardrums, like a frequency just below hearing, and it said, "You turned. So now you owe us a shift." And Callum bolted for the back room, slamming the door and huddling against the industrial freezer until his phone's clock read 3:37. And when he came out, the store was silent. The mirror showed only his own terrified face. And he thought it was over, but the next night, at exactly 3:34, without meaning to, his eyes drifted to the mirror, and there it was again, the dark figure. But now it was standing in the exact spot he'd been standing, and his reflection was nowhere to be seen. And that's when Callum understood that the thing in the mirror wasn't haunting the store. It was replacing him, one shift at a time, and he quit that same morning. driving straight to Adelaide with his eyes fixed on the road. But 6 months later, a friend who still worked the Stewart Highway servos sent him a photo, taken from the security camera at 3:35 a.m. And in the image, the store was empty, except for a tall, dark smudge standing behind the counter. And the security log showed a staff member named Callum had clocked in for the graveyard shift every night that week. Same employee ID. Same Penand, the friend texted, "You sure you quit? 'Cause you're on the roster and the drawer's never short." And Callum checked his own reflection in the phone screen, and for just a second, before the screen dimmed, his own eyes blinked when he hadn't blinked. And somewhere deep in the outback, a convex mirror now holds a permanent image of a young man with a slack smile who will never clock out. The gas station sat at the crossroads of two rural routes in northern Alberta, where the snow started in October and didn't leave until May. And Jenna had taken the overnight shift because it paid $4 more an hour, and she was saving for nursing school. And the supervisor, a quiet Cree elder named Mr. Whitford, who had worked that same station for 32 years, had given her exactly one piece of advice on her first night. If a child comes in alone after midnight, you do not speak to them, you do not look at their footprints, and you do not, under any circumstance, answer if they ask you to sing the missing verse. You just lock yourself in the washroom and you hum the old radio jingle until the wind stops. Because that's the only thing they can't mimic in Jenna. A practical girl raised on a dairy farm where the scariest thing was a bull with a bad attitude. Filed this under superstitions of lonely old men, and went about her nights stocking shelves and serving the occasional snowplow driver. And then, on the night of December 14th, a blizzard swept down from the territories like a white wall, and the roads were closed. The radio crackling with emergency alerts. And Jenna was huddled behind the counter with a space heater at her feet when the motion sensor at the front door chimed, and she looked up expecting a stranded motorist. But the figure that pushed through the door was a child, maybe 7 years old, wearing a thin red parka that was entirely wrong for the weather. No hat, no mittens, and the child's face was calm and dry despite the blizzard outside. And Jenna's training kicked in. You don't ignore a kid in a storm, so she said, "Hey, sweetie. Are you lost? Where are your parents?" And the child just stood in the drip of melting snow that wasn't melting because there was no snow on her. And then she smiled a smile that was too wide for a 7-year-old's face and said in a voice like wind through a cracked window, "Can you sing the missing verse?" And Jenna felt the words push against her mind like a finger pressing into soft clay. And suddenly she wanted to sing. She could almost hear a melody she didn't know she knew. A tune that tasted like cold copper, and she opened her mouth and caught herself just in time, slamming her jaw shut so hard her teeth clicked. And she remembered Mr. Whitford's words, and without another thought she scrambled for the washroom. The child's voice followed her, not louder, but closer. As if the child were somehow already inside the washroom, even though Jenna had locked the door. And the voice chanted, "We know the first part, we know the last part." But the middle's been gone since the bus wouldn't start, and Jenna pressed her back against the door, slid to the floor and began to hum the only jingle she could remember, the old pet food ad from the 90s. The one with the golden retriever end. She hummed it over and over while the handle rattled and the child's voice turned into a chorus of children. Dozens of them, all singing the same rhyme. And through the gap under the door, Jenna saw no shadows, no movement, just a cold so intense the metal doorknob began to frost over. And she hummed until her throat was raw and the jingle was just a tuneless rasp. And then, abruptly, the wind outside stopped, the handle stilled, and the only sound was the hum of the drinks cooler. And when Jenna finally opened the door, the store was empty. The front door locked from the inside. And on the floor where the child had stood was a single red mitten with a faded bus company logo, Northern Lights Charters. The one that had crashed into the Athabasca River in 1987 during a blizzard much like this one, a school bus carrying 23 children to a winter camp sing-along. And 11 of them were never found because the river ice had sealed over before the search crews could break through. And the news reports from that year mentioned that the children had been practicing a 3-verse folk song for the campfire. But the middle verse had been lost because the only teacher who knew it had died in the crash. And now Jenna understood what they wanted, those children trapped under the ice in the years. They wanted someone to finish the song so they could be whole. But the missing verse wasn't words, it was a soul. And if Jenna had sung it, she would have joined them, another voice in the cold chorus. And Mr. Whitford found her the next morning, still sitting in the washroom doorway, hoarse and trembling, and he just nodded and said, "You hummed the jingle. Good girl, the jingle's older than the missing verse. It's a shield my grandmother used it in the residential school when the spirits walked, and now you know why we pay $4 more. Now you know why this station never closes." And Jenna didn't quit. Because nursing school was expensive, and she was stubborn. But every night at the start of her shift, she now places a fresh red mitten on the counter with a little bell sewn into the cuff. And if the bell rings on its own, she hums the pet food jingle and doesn't stop until the sun touches the top of the pine trees because the children are still out there, still missing their verse. And one day a new hire who doesn't believe the old Cree elder will open their mouth and sing. And on that night the station will finally close. And under the ice of the Athabasca, 24 voices will harmonize at last. Marcus had been the night manager at a 24-hour Quick Mart on the outskirts of Bakersfield, California, for a year and a half, and he ran a tight ship, no headphones, no sleeping in the stockroom, and definitely no ignoring the store phone if it rang, because corporate could be calling with a secret shopper alert, or worse. And the phone was an old beige wall unit mounted behind the counter with a cord so tangled it looked like a nest of snakes. And it almost never rang between the hours of 11 p.m. and 5 a.m., except that one night in March when it rang at 3:19 a.m., and the caller ID displayed a number. Marcus didn't recognize, but the location was listed as in-store line aisle 9, which made no sense because there were no customer phones in the aisles. And Marcus, irritated and half asleep, picked up and said, "Quick Mart." Marcus speaking, and the voice on the other end was a man's voice. Calm and terribly close, like someone breathing directly into the receiver from 2 inches away. And it said, "Hey bud, can you check aisle 9 for me? I think I left my wallet there, black leather, should be by the canned beans." And Marcus, who had just walked aisle 9 10 minutes ago and seen no wallet and certainly no customer, felt a prickle at the back of his neck and said, "Sir, how are you calling from inside the store? Are you in the store?" And the voice laughed, a soft, wet laugh, and said, "I've been in the store for a long time." Marcus, "Longer than you've been alive. Go check aisle 9 and you'll see." And the line went dead. And Marcus slammed the phone down and grabbed the store phone to call the cops, but the line was dead too. No dial tone. Just a faint static that sounded almost like breathing, and he grabbed the heavy flashlight from under the counter and walked toward aisle 9 with his heart throwing itself against his sternum, and the store was silent except for the hum of the freezers. and when he reached the end of aisle 9, he saw something that made no sense. The floor of the aisle wasn't linoleum. It was dirt, packed earth like a cellar floor. And the shelves weren't stocked with beans and soup, but with jars of murky liquid that held things that moved slowly. And at the far end of the aisle, a man was sitting on an old wooden stool, a man in a faded Quick Mart uniform from the 1970s. His name tag reading Leon, and his smile was kind, but his eyes were gone. He's just smooth skin where eyes should be. And he held up a black leather wallet and said, "Found it right where I said," and Marcus, rooted to the spot, whispered, "Who are you?" And Leon tilted his head and said, "I was the night manager here before you. Opened this store in '73, but there was a gas leak, and I fell asleep in the break room and never woke up. And the company never told anyone because it was bad for business. So they just sealed the original aisle 9 and built a new one right on top. But I'm still here, still on shift, still waiting for someone to take my place so I can clock out." And then Leon stood up, and the jars on the shelves began to rattle, and the earth's floor seemed to breathe, a slow rise and fall like a chest. And he said, "You seem like a good manager, Marcus. Real dedicated. How about you stay and cover my shift? Just for a few decades. Until the next night manager comes along, it's not so bad. You get used to the dark." And Marcus did the only thing his body would let him do. He ran. He ran to the front door, but the door wouldn't open. It was like pushing against a wall of cold syrup. And Leon's voice came over the store intercom now. "Aisle 9 always needs a manager. Marcus. Always. That's the rule. The night shift never ends for us." And Marcus remembered the old break room story he'd been told on his first day by a veteran stalker who'd said, "Don't ever answer the phone if it says in store line." That's Leon checking in. He's been asking for coverage since '79, and Marcus. In a surge of desperate clarity, did the one thing Leon hadn't done. He pulled the fire alarm. The big red pole stationed by the entrance, and the alarm shrieked, and the sprinklers burst on. Then the cold syrup resistance vanished. The door swung open, and Marcus fell out into the parking lot, gasping. When he looked back, the store was normal. Lit up, clean, the linoleum floor of aisle 9 visible through the window with no jars, no stool, no Leon, and the next day he quit. And the day manager just nodded and said, "Leon gets one of you every 20 years or so. You're the first to get out." The fire alarm was smart. Leon can't stand noise. It reminds him of the explosion that never happened because the gas leak was silent. So the company just leaves that pole station operational even though it's not connected to anything. It's the only thing he respects. And Marcus now works a day job at a warehouse with no graveyard hours. But sometimes when he's driving past a Quick Mart late at night, he sees the in-store phone number flash on his own cell for half a second before it disappears. And he knows Leon is still in aisle 9, still on shift, still waiting. And one night a new manager who doesn't know the rule will pick up the phone and say, "Sure, I'll cover your shift," and Leon will finally clock out. That new manager will find himself on a stool in a dirt-floored aisle lined with jars, staring out at the store through walls that no longer exist, another blue-collar ghost in the clockwork of the graveyard shift. And there, they are 5 true graveyard shift stories that prove the scariest horrors don't come from movies. They come from the lonely fluorescent glow of a convenience store at 3 a.m., where blue-collar rules aren't just superstition. But the only thing standing between you and a permanent shift on the other side, if your pulse is still racing, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell every notification, is another night we stand watch together. And I need to hear from you. Which rule chilled you the most? The smiling trucker's frozen grin, the mirror's replacement reflection, or the lost child's chant. Drop your highlight moment in the comments, and if you've ever worked a night shift, share the unspoken rule that kept you safe. Because the graveyard shift doesn't end when the sun comes up. Pit just waits for the next person who doesn't know the rules. Stay safe, keep your eyes on the mirrors, and I'll see you on the next shift.